and welcome to the On the Whistle podcast. My name is Alistair Howarth, the co-host of the show. We're kicking off our preview series ahead of the Africa Cup of Nations, looking at Nigeria today. The Super Eagles are coming into the tournament with a lot of question marks, but high hopes. Just ask Frank Onyeka. We certainly did keep an eye out for that interview that we did with him coming up. But we are joined to talk about the Super Eagles and their chances by Sky Sports' own, BBC Sports' own, CAF's own, one of the most brilliant journalists we have on the continent, Mimi Fawaz. Mimi joined us to discuss how the team looks going into the tournament.
Mimi, it's so good to see you and to have you back on the podcast. I know last time we had you were talking about the CAF Awards and the brilliance that we've seen coming from Nigeria, but now we're going to chat about whether Nigeria have that same brilliance to go all the way and win the AFCON in Cote d'Ivoire in just a couple of weeks. I've got to ask you first off, Nigeria is such a unique country when it comes to football. The size of the country, the history behind it, but also kind of the way in which oftentimes they underperform or perform when you don't expect them to. It's such a chaotic country in so many ways. There's so much expectation on the Super Eagles coming into to this AFCON, as there is every single AFCON. It's unavoidable. What is your sense? What is the mood in Nigeria? How are we feeling? How are you feeling about the Super Eagles coming into AFCON 2023?
Well, I mean, it's a weird one because in a way, I think Nigerians don't have high expectations, and yet in another way, I think they still expect them to do well. So it's like a mixed bag. And the reason why I say that is I can only base it on, let's look at the World Cup qualifiers for 2026 that started just a couple of weeks ago. Nigeria got off to having a 1-1 draw against Lesotho at home. And that wasn't taken very well at all by Nigerian football fans because they feel Nigeria's ranked way above Lesotho as star players. And you're playing at home and you struggled to draw against Lesotho. So that wasn't seen well at all. And then when you look at them playing the second leg, their second match for the qualifiers in their group was against Zimbabwe away. And they played in Rwanda, and Nigeria came from behind. Zimbabwe scored first, and Nigeria really struggled again in that match. And it was a Kelechi Iheanacho goal that helped to level it for Nigeria. But again, there's two performances where Nigeria struggled. So I think Nigerian football fans are really not happy. I don't think they've been very happy with the performances recently of the Super Eagles. So in a way, I don't think they're high expectations, but saying that, Nigerians, though they might not be high expectations, when they start the tournament, they do expect them to do well or to at least go far in the competition. So it's a very tricky one. It's a balancing act, but many fans are very unhappy about the performances and the coach Jose Peseiro at the moment, to be honest.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a testament to kind of what we were saying to the kind of chaotic nature of Nigeria, because obviously in the last 12 to 18 months, you've had a 10-0 victory, you've had a 6-0 victory, some of the biggest wins in Nigerian football history, in African football history. And then you follow that up with, 1-1 draw with Lesotho, which I don't think we can get away from how bad a result that is at home, like you said. And even, yes, Zimbabwe is a slightly better team, but they've hardly played any football the last 2 years, and they're playing in Rwanda. They're not even playing at home in Zimbabwe. So kind of two terrible performances in terms of the results for Nigeria, and obviously missing Victor Osimhen, who will come on to in those games, but still with the kind of talent on offer with Nigeria, that's just not good enough. And I wanted to ask about that because obviously I feel like we had the exact same conversation last AFCON when we were previewing it together. Is Nigeria have this, and specifically Jose Peseiro, the coach, has this really difficult problem where you've got up front one of the best group of attackers in world football. I don't think any country in the world has as many attackers that has Nigeria, to the point where Tawo Awoniyi might miss out on the tournament. And it almost doesn't matter because you've got Victor Boniface, who's been one of the best strikers in Germany, coming through in his place. You've got Victor Osimhen, who's the best striker and arguably in the world, alongside the likes of Harry Kane and Mbappe. And so it's an unbelievable amount of talent up front. But then you've got this issue where you're struggling for talent in the midfield. Defensively, Calvin Bassey and Semi Ajayi have shown that they're really solid defenders, but aren't elite level defenders. And then the big question is, in goal, who's going to play there? It's been Francis Uzoho the last couple qualifiers, but he's hardly played club football. I think even in I think he plays in Cyprus, doesn't he? So there's big questions there. How is Jose Peseiro managing this team, and how do you think he can get the best out of these outrageous talents up front whilst not kind of compromising the team too much defensively?
Well, I mean, I think that is the question. Even many football fans will say individually, Nigeria has incredible talent. And even as you've just outlined, going forward, they really have world-class talent. But when it comes to the collective, it's not working. It's not gelling. Jose Peseiro doesn't seem to have got the formula to make it work for the Nigerian team and for Nigerian football fans. Now, I've been speaking to some, of course, former players of Nigeria and as well other former players who are not Nigerian about what exactly is going wrong in Nigeria. The coach himself has to bear some responsibility. I don't think there are many Nigerians that feel he's the right person to take the team very far, just generally in terms of Nigerian football. And I mean, the federation itself, a source has said that if they had the money to terminate his contract, they probably would, but they don't have the funds to do that. So hence why they're still carrying on with him. And let's not forget that he took a pay cut. He agreed to a pay cut. I think it was in September. And they're still not able to, they wanted to relieve him of his duties to do that. So I think that says a lot when it doesn't seem that they have much faith in their coach. So he obviously bears some responsibility, but as well, as I said, I've spoken to some former Nigerian and just former African players. They say to look at the midfield, that the midfield is not creating the opportunities that you need to service the forwards. And some have even said it's left a big gap since John Mikelobi left the team, not having the kind of service that you need to finish those goals. So that makes it hard, for example, for players like Osimhen. You see him really hungry a lot of the times, running around a lot, trying to get those goals, but he's not always getting the service that he necessarily needs. So that's obviously an area that needs to be looked at. And as well, as we've said, the goalkeeping is another huge area that many Nigerians are not happy with. And I guess Francis Uzoho has been on the receiving end of a lot of the unhappiness of the Nigerian football fans. I mean, if you even think back to the last World Cup in Qatar, it was that goal that Thomas Partey scored, and that a lot of Nigerians felt that Uzoho could have stopped, and he didn't stop, and then that ended up taking Ghana to the World Cup in Qatar. And we've seen as well some errors in the past few matches, so that's left many Nigerian fans concerned, in those two areas. And as I said, look at the World Cup qualifiers that they've started. Nigeria are third in their group right now, and so fans are worried. Will it be the same thing again? Will Nigeria miss out on a second consecutive World Cup? I mean, I know we're still in the early days, so we can't be making definite answers right now, but there's still things that seem to be reoccurring over and over and over again, and Jose Peseiro doesn't seem to be able to find the solutions for Nigeria going forward.
And like you mentioned, that World Cup, qualifiers look already a bit in danger. And of course, the way it works now, you got these bigger groups of 6 teams, but it's only one that goes through, and maybe the second place can scratch a playoff. But of course, you're in the group with South Africa, who had that surprising loss to Rwanda, but before that, I think had gone 11 games unbeaten, had beaten Morocco, and looked like they're starting to be a serious team. And so Nigeria can't really afford to have slip-ups against your Lesotho's and your Zimbabwe's. I guess the only thing they can hope is Lesotho and Zimbabwe will also do the same to South Africa, especially when there's kind of that neighborly rivalry going on, and there'll be a lot more extra motivation for those. We're talking a little bit about Nigeria's deficiencies here, but let's talk about what they have going for them, and the biggest one is obviously Victor Osimhen, because he has been sensational. We had you on the podcast to talk about how deserving he was to get the CAF Player of the Year, and I guess he's unique as well as one of these players who has. The reason he got that award was essentially because of his brilliance at Napoli and, being the main man and getting them back their first Scudetto since Maradona. But he's also one of these players who, despite Nigeria's struggles, despite the challenges, he has been sensational for them. And, you just look at the AFCON qualifiers, 10 goals in 6 games is unreal. And particularly when you think about how little service he's getting, talking about how, that gap left by John Obi Mikel hasn't been filled. He's still getting 10 goals. We talked about during the CAF Awards that he was the first Nigerian to get that award of being the best player in Africa since Kanu in 1999. Is Osimhen Nigeria's best player since? Is he their best player of the 21st century? And how much of Nigeria's hopes and the Super Eagles' hopes rest on his immense shoulders?
I mean, Nigeria's had great players in history for sure, and I think Osimhen will go down as as one of the great players that Nigeria has had, especially in this generation. But let's not rule out that Nigeria have had some fantastic players throughout history. One of them as well being JJ Okocha. But I do hope things turn out well for Nigeria at the Africa Cup of Nations. Let's not forget Osimhen missed the last one in Cameroon due to the injury. He had surgery on his face. So I think it's really great. Hope, touch wood, no injury will come. I think it's really good to have one of the best African strikers, if we look at the awards that he picked up at the moment, to be at the Africa Cup of Nations. And if Jose Peseiro can just get this team, I don't know what he can do from now to then. We've only got a few weeks to go. If he can just make it work, then I think Nigeria can be a lethal force at AFCON, especially with Osimhen fit and firing. If we're able to service him with those balls to get the goals in the back of the net, then I think Nigeria is a team to be feared at the Africa Cup of Nations. But again, all that depends on Jose Peseiro. I'm not the coach. So he has work to do, as I said. He's not been able to find a solution so far. Let's see if he's able to, miraculously, I hope so, come the Africa Cup of Nations. And it's sad as well that Taiwo Awoniyi picked up an injury. I'm not too sure if he's going to be ready for the Africa Cup of Nations, to be honest. I don't know, because he's meant to be on the sidelines for a while. He too was really picking up form for his team, Nottingham Forest. So, but we've got Osimhen, we've got Taiwo Awoniyi. You've spoken about Victor Boniface, Ademola Lookman, and Kelechi Iheanacho as well springs a surprise every now and then, as we saw in Zimbabwe, and he has been a good player for Nigeria, I have to say, in the past few matches. So we can't rule out his influence and his impact on the team come the Africa Cup of Nations.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's going to be one of the biggest challenges of any coach, I think, is Peseiro to knit together this team, as kind of we talked about that. I want to look towards your group, because in many senses, Nigeria is in a very similar group to what they had in the 2021 AFCON. There it was Egypt, Sudan, and Guinea-Bissau. Obviously, Guinea-Bissau are here again, and you played them in qualifying. You beat them 1-0 away, but also lost 1-0 at home. And this time you've got Equatorial Guinea and Ivory Coast alongside them. But I guess my question is, coming into this, is I guess it's, how confident are you going into this group? But also the real question, I think, is, does it even matter? Because we saw at the last AFCON that Nigeria cruised through that group, beat Egypt, beat Guinea-Bissau, beat Sudan, looked like, for me, the best team at the AFCON after the group stage, and then somehow managed to lose against the Tunisia side that, came behind both Mali and Gambia in their group. So I guess the question is that going to be the real challenge for Nigeria, is not just managing the group? Because, we should expect them to come in that top two with Ivory Coast, and anything but that would be seen, I think, as a real failure. But it's once they get past that, once they're in the knockouts and they have to play some of the better teams, like, if they come second, they'll likely play Cameroon or South Africa. Where is that real challenge going to come for the Super Eagles? And do they have the time, like you said, to get into good shape before they have to play some of these teams, before that first match against Guinea-Bissau?
As I've come to realize in African football, expect the unexpected. So like you mentioned, Nigeria won one of the top teams in the group stages in the last AFCON, but when it came to the last 16, they lost to Tunisia. So I don't think we should underestimate any team in African football. There are no minnows anymore, because even Equatorial Guinea have been performing really well lately in their matches. So I don't think we can just say it's a walk in the park. Egypt, I think they're going to give Nigeria, if they ever were to face them like further down, a tough run for their money this time. Not like how it was in the group stages, because Egypt are cruising through their World Cup qualifiers. They've had an incredible past few months in terms of performances that they're delivering. So I think Nigeria has a bit of work to do. They are playing as well the host Ivory Coast in the group stages, and it's always going to be a very difficult one when you're facing the host at home. I remember the last time, if I'm correct, that Nigeria played Ivory Coast was in the 2013 Africa Cup of Nations in South Africa, and I was at the stadium when Nigeria beat Ivory Coast in the quarterfinal. So it would be great to see that matchup again. And I was speaking to Salomon Kalou, who was in that team that Nigeria beat in the quarterfinals. I spoke to him in Morocco for the CAF Awards just a few days ago, and he as well said what an incredible team Nigeria is now. But as we spoke about, like he felt midfield is lacking that creativity. But as well, he said them losing to Nigeria in the quarterfinals, he just couldn't believe it because they themselves, Ivory Coast, had incredible players that even included Yaya Toure in that team. But so I'm sure Ivory Coast will be hoping that there won't be a repeat of that match in 2013. And Ivory Coast themselves have been putting some really good performances lately. And I said they have that home crowd. And as Salam Okalu said to me, their stadiums are going to be packed, completely packed. So you can just imagine all those home fans in the stadium cheering the team on. So I don't think it's going to be an easy ride for Nigeria. But of course, as I said, Nigeria have the talent. If it can all just come, the different pieces of the puzzle can come together, I think they can go far.
Yeah, it's interesting, maybe because you talk about yeah, absolutely, Equatorial Guinea and Guinea-Bissau are no pushovers. I think particularly Equatorial Guinea, they showed that they could do it against they competed with Ivory Coast. They're obviously in their group in 2021. They lost, but they competed, and then they beat Algeria. Did so well to get all the way to the quarterfinals. But yeah, and it's interesting you then talking about Salomon Kalou saying that there's going to be a huge support. I wanted to ask, are you expecting a huge kind of traveling crowd of Nigerians getting to the Ivory Coast? Obviously, not neighbors. You have to, get through a few countries, Benin, Togo, and Ghana. But realistically, in the grand scheme of things, it's not a really far trip from Lagos to Abidjan. Are you expecting a kind of Nigerians to travel in their thousands to the AFCON?
Well, I mean, obviously, I don't expect the same numbers as I would for Ivory Coast fans in their own country. I'm having big numbers. They'll outnumber Nigeria for sure. But there are many Nigerians who live in Ivory Coast. So I would expect the home based supporters to be there in full force supporting Nigeria. I've even had some of them tweets me already on Twitter saying they're ready for all of us Nigerian journalists. So I think there will be a fan base for sure because there's still a nice number of Nigerians living in the Ivory Coast. And as you said, it's not that far away. It's like, what, about an hour and a half flight from Nigeria roughly to Ivory Coast. So it's also a very short journey. So, when you always see in the matches, you always see the drums, as you know, I've just seen in the stadiums, the singing, the chanting, the dancing of Nigerian fans. So they definitely will themselves make their voices heard, however big or small that they are in the stadium, chanting on the Super Eagles, as they did as well in Cameroon. There were lots of them traveling around, and you could always hear them, even if it was a small group of them. The music, the chanting, it was quite loud, anyways, to spur on the Nigerian players.
Absolutely, and I think particularly in African football, we can't underestimate how much that proximity makes a difference. Famously, North African teams, if they're not Egypt, struggle when they come below the Sahara, and so those kind of what oftentimes we call it kind of intangibles do make a real difference in having a big crowd. Obviously, like you say, you won't be outnumbering the Ivorians, but come those other games, it might feel more like a home game for Nigeria than most other countries. We've talked about the mood and kind of how Jose Peseiro, has to put together this team. But I kind of want to ask, when you're looking at this AFCON, obviously we see the big favorites, Morocco coming off that World Cup, Senegal being the holders and, dominating in African football since then in terms of the, youth categories and the CHAN and everything. And there's almost a sense, that Nigeria aren't considered one of the favorites coming into this tournament, which again feels so strange when you see the amount of talent that this team has. I guess what are the, does that help Nigeria, for once, or coming into a tournament and not having that many expectations on them externally. I know you talked about how there's always expectation internally, but do you think that will help them kind of almost being the underdogs? And even in their group, I think Ivory Coast would be considered favorites. Do you think that will help the Super Eagles kind of manage this tournament?
I don't know. I mean, maybe not having that pressure, but I think the Nigerian team have pressure as it is because the Nigerian fans have not been happy at all with their performances lately. So whether I think they're favorites or not, they're still going to have pressure in some way, shape, or form. Whether I guess most people would be looking at, as we said, Ivory Coast. Never rule out the host, and Ivory Coast have been doing very well lately, so they're one of the favorites. And as you've mentioned, Morocco are another one of the favorites based off of their World Cup performance in Qatar. And I spoke to Walid Regragui after he picked up his coach of the year, the men's coach of the year, just a few days ago in Morocco, and he says, of course, there's pressure. There is pressure on the Moroccan team, especially off the back of such a fantastic World Cup, being the first African team to make the semi-final. So people will expect them to put in a good performance. And then you have Senegal, the defending champions as well, who will obviously want to hold on to their title. And as a federation president said, it's been the success of Senegal, both at the Africa Cup of Nations and the other domestic titles across the continent in the past 2 years. They've been picking up all their awards. So he said it's been 10 years of planning. They've put in a proper planning in place. And now that's why you're seeing the dividends to the success that they have. But Egypt as well. Egypt are doing really well at the moment. It's a resurgence of this Egyptian team from the last Africa Cup of Nations, putting great results in the World Cup qualifiers. Mossala as well been performing very well. So I think they're one of the teams to definitely watch out for in this Africa Cup of Nations. So yes, maybe Nigeria is not up there. If we're discussing looking at these other sides, but I think they still will have some sort of pressure because fans have not been happy with the performance. We can't say that enough. They've not been happy, and they always make themselves heard on social media every time Nigeria doesn't put a performance they're happy with.
If you're the Super Eagles, there's always pressure. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if you're the worst team, the best team. There's always pressure to compete, and I guess that's one of the biggest challenges that you always have to manage as a Super Eagles player and coach. And obviously it's a decade on from the Super Eagles' last success at the AFCON back in 2013 under Stephen Keshi. You kind of referenced the Ivorian game in particular. It was a great team. But Mimi, we appreciate you coming to speak with us. How we always finish off these previews with a quick fire round of questions. So I'm going to put you on the spot. I'm going to ask you some of the hardest questions I've got, and some of the. Well, we'll start, I guess, with an easy one in terms of, for you, who is coming into this tournament? Who is Nigeria's best player?
Nigeria's best player definitely is Victor Osimhen, no doubt. Whenever he's not in the team, you miss his presence. So it's definitely Nigeria's best player.
Yeah, I think that's probably the easiest country to ask that question, maybe along with Egypt. But if Osimhen is the best player, who in this team, kind of the youngsters, are there any young players breaking into the Super Eagles team that people should be keeping an eye out for at this tournament and could be the breakout stars?
I would definitely like to see how Victor Boniface performs, to be honest, at this Africa Cup of Nations, especially as he's been one of the players that we've been talking a lot about. He's been getting a lot of attention for his team and his performances by Leverkusen. So it will be good to see if he gets a chance to show his abilities in this competition.
Absolutely, and he might get that chance. We're talking about Aweniyi might be fit, might not, and you'd imagine that amongst the litany of brilliant talent you have up front, but Boniface is probably going to be one of the first names in terms of getting on that team sheet along with Osimhen. But it'll be interesting to see. I think he's such an exciting player, Boniface, isn't he? So now I'm going to ask you the hard question, Mimi. I need your prediction. How far Nigeria going at the AFCON? Where will you win it? Where will you crash out? How far is Nigeria going?
I'm not even right. Listen, I'm Nigerian of Nigerian heritage. I'm always going to want my country to do well. So, Super Eagles, don't let us down. Jose Peseiro, Make it work. So all I'm going to say is I just hope Nigeria does very well. I'm not predicting any exits, nothing. We're rooting behind you, so let's hope that you get the
Uh,
job done.
you heard it here first. Mimi Fawaz, Nigeria they're gonna go all the way. They're gonna win it. She has no doubts, no issues. Don't worry. Well, that clears up my next question because I was going to ask who's going to win the tournament, but I don't need to ask that because it's the Super Eagles.
No, you also got to, apart from Nigeria, who I wish well for sure, Egypt are looking great. Egypt are definitely a team to watch out for. And they'll be looking, don't forget, to get that eighth Africa Cup of Nations. That's what they wanted so badly against Senegal last time around. They got through to the final, but they really are looking good. Morocco, you can't rule them out. That historic run in Qatar to the semifinals, first African country to do so. Walid Regragui is a fantastic coach, great man management. So a team to also look out for. Never rule out the defending champion Senegal as well. They're also one that you could just never rule out. And then as well, they're always unexpected results teams that we just never know that could perform well.
Absolutely. Could never rule anyone out at the AFCON. It's one of the reasons we love it. Again, this made easy because you're Nigerian, but my next question is who's going to be the top scorer at this AFCON?
I'm going for, well, I want to say Victor Osimhen, especially as he's the top scorer for the AFCON qualifier. So it'll be good to see him get on the score sheet. But I mean, like, I think we could also see some. Let's see, maybe I think Mo Salah will have. I mean, he was great for me. He still put in. He really, helped to carry Egypt through with some big results in the last AFCON. So I can never rule out Mohamed Salah.
Absolutely, Salah has been in terrific form, just like Osimhen. and I guess this goes along with it. And again, Mimi, you made this a hard one because obviously you're Nigerian and because Victor Osimhen is so dominant and like you said, you're expecting Nigeria to win the tournament. But my last question is who's going to be the player of the tournament? I don't know if you have a different answer or if you think if Osimhen's going to be the top scorer, he'll also be the best player.
Yeah, I think he definitely isn't. You can't come off the back of winning a CAF award as the best African player and not be in contention as being one of the best players in the tournament. We could also see. Let's me quickly as well mention Yassine Bouno, an incredible player, incredible performances as well in the World Cup for Morocco. He as well could be a player that could put in some fantastic performances like he did at the World Cup. Mohamed Salah is another one. So, and Mane, let's not rule out Mane. Mane had a good AFCON as well in the last AFCON. So I think it could be amongst the mix of these players that I've mentioned.
And I think with it, thinking of someone like Mane or even Bono is interesting because, we've hardly talked about, or anyone's hardly talked about the way in which the Saudi Pro League is going to impact the AFCON because yes, Mane isn't playing at perhaps the level that he was at Liverpool, like a Salah, but he's also not working as hard as guys like Salah. And so he's probably going to come into the tournament in some of his best shape, as opposed to players like Salah and Osimhen who've been playing, elite level football in Europe for the past 3 or 4 months nonstop, must be exhausted. Whereas, Mane and Bonu and Seko Fofana, these other guys are all going to come into it probably looking a lot more fresh. But we'll see. We'll have to wait and see. Mimi, thank you so much for speaking to us. It's brilliant to hear your expertise and get your opinions as always. And we look forward to bringing you on the pod again and chatting to you soon.